The scent of funeral flowers clung to my black dress, a perfume of loss that had seeped into my very skin. For 6 agonizing months, I had sat by my sister Sarah's bedside, holding her hand as cancer, that insidious thief, slowly stole the light from her eyes. I had memorized the stark, sterile landscape of the hospice room, the hushed voices of nurses, the relentless beeping of monitors that finally fell silent. The emptiness she left behind was not just an emotion. It was a physical ache, a hollowed-out space beneath my ribs that echoed with every breath. All I wanted, all my grieving soul craved, was the sanctuary of home. The familiar, comforting creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the solid warmth of my son's embrace, the quiet, unassuming peace of my own 4 walls. I was a ship with tattered sails, limping back to port after a devastating storm. I guided my 10-year-old sedan into the familiar driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires a sound I had associated with safety for over 2 decades. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, gathering the strength to walk inside, to begin the impossible task of living in a world without Sarah. But as I opened the car door and my feet met the ground, my purse slipped from my numb fingers, spilling its contents onto the drive. It was a moment of clumsy vulnerability, a prelude to the shock that was about to eviscerate what was left of my composure. I straightened up, and the world tilted on its axis. There, strewn across the manicured lawn I had so carefully nurtured for 20 years, was my life, displayed like garbage awaiting collection. My clothes, not just old rags, but the elegant blouse I'd worn to Mark's college graduation, the warm winter coat Michael had given me our last Christmas together, were tossed carelessly over the thorny branches of my prize-winning rose bushes. My books, their spines cracked from years of love, lay with their pages fluttering in the indifferent breeze like wounded birds. Photographs of my late husband, his smile forever frozen in time, stared up at the cold, gray sky from a pile of tangled linens. The hand-knitted blanket my mother had made for my hope chest 60 years ago was balled up in a heap of sensible shoes. It was a grotesque collage of my 67 years on this earth, a public, humiliating eviction of my most private memories and cherished milestones. Every item told a story, and they had been collectively deemed worthless. I stood paralyzed, my hand flying to my mouth. The air was punched from my lungs, leaving me in a soundless, gasping vacuum. "What?" I finally whispered to the uncaring air, my voice a frail, broken thread of sound. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a cruel extension of the grief that already threatened to consume me. And then she appeared. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, emerged from the front door of my house, the 2-story colonial I had bought with 40 years of sweat cleaning offices after Michael passed, the one I had painted a cheerful, hopeful butter yellow with my own hands. She looked like she had just stepped from the pages of a glossy magazine, a stark, infuriating contrast to the scene of devastation she had orchestrated. Her blonde hair was a perfect, sleek cascade, her makeup was flawless, and she wore a sleek emerald green dress that I knew, with a sickening certainty, cost more than my entire monthly pension. She looked vibrant and alive, while I was a ghost in a funeral dress, covered in the dust of the grave. "Eleanor, you're back," she chirped, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness I knew was as fake as the designer labels she coveted. She picked her way daintily through the wreckage of my life as if it were a minor inconvenience. "We were just doing a little deep cleaning. A purge, you know. All this old stuff was just collecting dust and taking up so much space. It's all useless now." I stared at her, my hands beginning to tremble with a mixture of rage and profound shock. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words was a physical slap. "Useless," I repeated, the word tasting like acid and ashes. "Chloe, those are my children's baby albums. Those are my personal documents, my tax records, my birth certificate. Those clothes, that's the suit I wore to my husband's funeral." She waved a dismissive, perfectly manicured hand, her red nails catching the weak afternoon sun. "Oh, I know. But we really need the space in your old room. We're turning it into the nursery. Didn't Mark tell you? I'm 3 months pregnant. The baby needs a proper room, not a storage closet." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, right in the hollow space Sarah had left. Pregnant. My son's wife was carrying my grandchild, a tiny beacon of future joy in this time of immense sorrow, and I was finding out like this. Not with a joyful phone call, not with a tender moment shared between mother and son, but here, on the heels of my sister's funeral, standing amid the wreckage of my belongings, delivered as a cold, logistical explanation for my exile. I need to speak to Mark, I stammered, my voice cracking, betraying the devastation I was trying so hard to contain. He's at work, of course, pulling a late one, but don't you worry, she said, her smile never faltering as she linked her arm with mine in a gesture of false intimacy that made my skin crawl. We didn't leave you out in the cold. We're not monsters. Come on, I'll show you your new space. She led me, numb and compliant, around the side of the house, away from the humiliating spectacle on the front lawn, as if shielding the neighbors from the sight of my disgrace. She stopped at the warped wooden door to the rear utility room, a cramped, uninsulated space we used for storing bags of potting soil, rusty gardening tools, and the lawnmower. She swung the door open with a theatrical flourish. Tata, see, we cleaned it up for you. We even put in a folding bed. It's cozy, don't you think? I peered inside, my heart sinking into the pit of my stomach. The room was no larger than a prison cell, maybe 6 by 6 feet. It smelled overwhelmingly of damp earth, mildew, and gasoline. A single, bare, low-wattage bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a sickly yellow light. The mentioned folding bed was a rickety, aluminum-framed thing with a thin, stained mattress that had visible lumps. A fat, black spider scuttled into a dark corner. This damp, dark, filthy hole was where they intended for me to live, in the house I owned, after I had just buried my only sister. Something inside me, something that had been bending for years under the weight of her subtle condescension, her casual criticisms of my old-fashioned ways, and my son's increasingly passive compliance, finally snapped. But it wasn't a break of despair or surrender. It was the sharp, clean, decisive snap of a steel trap being armed. The grief, the exhaustion, the betrayal, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying point of absolute clarity and cold, terrifying calm. I turned to her slowly, my movements deliberate. I looked her directly in her cold, calculating blue eyes, and I saw the triumph there, the unshakable belief that she had won. You know what, Chloe? I said, my voice unnervingly steady, devoid of all the tremor and grief that had been there moments before. You're absolutely right. It is time for a deep clean, a thorough, definitive clean-out of everything that is no longer useful to me. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her perfectly constructed facade, a flicker of confusion. What are you talking about? I didn't answer. I simply reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out my simple, outdated cell phone. My fingers, which had been trembling uncontrollably just moments before, were now perfectly steady as I navigated the menu. I found the number I needed, not stored in my contacts, but seared into my memory. The number for Mr. Aldrich, my lawyer, the executor of my estate, and the man who had handled all my legal affairs since Michael passed. What are you doing? Chloe asked, the fake sweetness evaporating from her voice, replaced by a sharp, suspicious edge. The fly was not behaving as expected. Exactly what you suggested, I replied, my gaze locked on hers, unblinking. Cleaning up. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the electronic ring. As I waited for Mr. Aldrich to answer, I didn't look away from Chloe. For the first time in the 3 years since she'd married my son, I held her gaze without flinching, without backing down, without the quiet apology that usually lingered in my eyes. In that moment, a profound and powerful understanding washed over me, as cleansing and cold as a winter wave. I had given them this house out of a bottomless, unconditional well of love for my son, but I had never, ever signed away my dignity. And they were about to discover the crucial, devastating difference between a generous mother and a foolish old woman they could push into a storage room. Aldrich Law, a familiar, calm voice answered. Mr. Aldrich, I said, my voice clear, firm, and resonant in the quiet backyard. It's Eleanor Vance. I need to see you in your office first thing tomorrow morning. It's urgent. I heard the immediate concern in his tone. Eleanor, are you all right? I heard about Sarah, my condolences. No, I interrupted, my eyes still fixed on Chloe's now wary, calculating face. But I'm going to be. I ended the call without another word. Chloe was staring at me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her previous smugness replaced by a simmering irritation. I don't know what little game you're playing, but I'll remind you that this house belongs to Mark, and I am his wife. So if you want to stay here, you'll follow our rules, all of them. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of my chin. Of course, I'll take the utility room. I saw the surprise flicker in her eyes, quickly masked. She had expected tears, pleading, dramatic outbursts. My calm, unnerving acquiescence was a variable she hadn't accounted for. She recovered quickly, her mask of benign authority slipping back into place, though it was now strained at the edges. Good. I'm glad you understand. And another thing, we'll need you to be discreet. With the baby on the way, the doctor says I can't have any stress. No loud noises, no unexpected visitors. You understand? I gave her a slow, deliberate nod, my expression unreadable. Of course, no problem at all. She turned and walked back into the main house, her hips swaying with the confidence of a victor who still believes the battle is won. But she was wrong. She hadn't won. She had simply started a war she didn't yet know we were fighting, and she had just handed me my first and most powerful weapon, the element of surprise. I stepped into the tiny, dark, foul-smelling room and closed the door, plunging myself into near darkness. The thin sliver of light under the door illuminated dancing motes of dust. I leaned my back against the rough wood, and only then, in the oppressive, lonely silence, did I allow the first tear to fall. It traced a clean path through the grime on my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of defeat. It was one of farewell. Farewell to the woman I had been, the trusting mother, the accommodating mother-in-law, the woman who always chose peace over conflict. That woman was gone, buried alongside her sister today. The woman left standing in this damp, dark room was someone new, someone forged in the fires of betrayal, someone who had just looked into the abyss and decided to start building a bridge across it. And the first, foundational truth of that bridge was this: the deed to this house was still, and had always been, solely in my name. They were living in my house, and I was just beginning to remember what it felt like to be the landlord. The night in the utility room was the longest of my life. The folding bed groaned and sagged beneath my weight, its thin mattress offering no comfort, only a reminder of my displacement. The smell of damp soil and gasoline was a constant presence, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented linen of my old bedroom. Every creak of the main house, every faint murmur of voices, felt like a violation. They were in my kitchen, sitting on my sofa, living a life that had systematically erased me. I didn't sleep. I lay in the oppressive darkness, the cold seeping into my bones, and I planned. The heartbroken widow was gone. In her place was a general preparing for battle. Mr. Aldrich was my first ally, but I needed more. I needed evidence. A sliver of gray dawn light finally pierced the single grimy window. I heard the main house come to life, the distant hum of a coffee grinder, the water pipes groaning. I waited until I heard Mark's car pull out of the driveway, heading to work without a word to me. The cowardice of it stung, but I used the pain, channeling it into resolve. Once silence fell, I slipped out of my cell. I wasn't going to wait for a lawyer to save me. Salvation, I had learned, was a thing you had to build yourself. I went to the garden shed, retrieved a spare key I kept hidden for emergencies, and let myself back into my own house. It felt alien. The furniture had been rearranged, my cherished knickknacks replaced with cold, minimalist decor. It was Chloe's house now in every way but the legal one. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my mission clear. I went to the small office nook where the household files were kept. The drawer was locked. A petty, predictable power move, but I was the original homeowner. I knew where the spare key was taped beneath the desk drawer. My fingers found it, cold and familiar. Inside, I found a chaos of paper, but beneath the new, glossy catalogs and credit card statements in Chloe's name, I found what I was looking for, the files I had meticulously kept for decades, and tucked in the back, a simple, spiral-bound notebook, my ledger. For years, I had recorded every major household expense. It was a habit born of necessity, from a time when every dollar counted. When I gave Mark the house, I'd asked him to keep me informed of any significant outlays, not to control him, but because a house is a living thing that needs care. He had humored me for a while, but as I flipped through the pages, the entries in his handwriting grew sparse, then stopped altogether about a year ago. That's when my own entries began again, in my own shaky script. I had noticed things. A new car in the driveway every few months. A constant stream of delivery boxes. Chloe's ever-changing wardrobe. So I had started logging again, based on bank statements from the joint account I still monitored. I told myself I was just being an organized retiree. Now, I knew I had been a detective collecting clues to my own murder. The numbers were staggering. I cross-referenced my ledger with the recent statements I printed with trembling hands. January, $4,500, living room remodel. February, $5,200, new furniture. March, $3,800, miscellaneous, a chillingly vague term. April, $6,100, trip to Miami. May, $4,800, various purchases. June, $5,400, interior decorator. July, $7,300, no description. August, $7,900, baby expenses. It added up to nearly $45,000 in 8 months. My breath hitched. Mark was a competent engineer, but his salary wasn't this. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I remembered then, with the clarity of a lightning strike, the $60,000 savings account I had given him access to, my retirement severance and life savings. For emergencies, I had said, so you'll never lack for anything. My hands shook so violently I could barely dial the number for the bank's automated line. I entered the account number, the PIN, Michael's birthday. The robotic voice recited the balance, and the world dropped out from under me. Current balance, $8,954.32. A noise, a strangled whimper, escaped my lips. I slid down the wall onto the cold floor, the phone clattering beside me. More than $50,000. Gone. They had been burning through my future while planning to relegate me to a storage room. The betrayal was so vast, so calculated. It felt less like a personal failure and more like a natural disaster that had leveled my entire life. But I couldn't afford to break. Not yet. I gathered the papers, my ledger, the damning bank statements. This was my ammunition. I took pictures of the utility room, of my belongings still scattered on the lawn, now damp with dew. Evidence. I had to think in terms of evidence. At 9:01 a.m., I was sitting in the plush, quiet office of Mr. Aldrich. I had changed into my best suit, the one I wore for funerals and court appearances. Dignity was my armor now. I laid it all out before him. The photos, the ledger, the bank statements, the story of my return, the utility room, the pregnancy. I spoke without crying, my voice a monotone of suppressed fury and pain. Mr. Aldrich listened, his expression growing graver with each revelation. When I finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Alina, this is egregious." "The house," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "Is it still?" He opened a file on his desk, pulling out a copy of the deed. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a chess master who has just seen a path to checkmate. "It is 100% in your name, Alina. The gift was never formalized with a new deed. Legally, Robert has what's called a tenancy at will. You lent him the house. You can unlend it." The relief was so potent it made me dizzy. I had a foundation to stand on. "And the money?" I asked. He reviewed the statements. "If these transfers were made without your explicit authorization from an account solely in your name, this could be construed as misappropriation. Family fraud." "I don't want him in jail," I said quickly, the mother in me reflexively leaping to her child's defense. "Then we use it as leverage," he said, his eyes sharp. "We reclaim your power. Here is what we do." He laid out a plan, crisp and professional. First, we would secure all my accounts, changing every password. Second, we would formally inventory the missing and sold items from the house. Third, we would present Robert with a choice: a formal lease agreement with monthly rent and a legally binding repayment plan for the stolen $45,000 or eviction proceedings. "Rent?" I asked, horrified. "From my own son." "Alina," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your son allowed his wife to throw you out of your house and steal your life savings. He does not deserve to live there for free. He was right. The truth was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it. I left his office an hour later, a sheaf of new documents in my bag and a cold fire in my heart. The next part of his plan was the hardest. I had to go to the bank. Standing at the teller's window, requesting the closure of the joint account and the removal of Mark's access, felt like publicly severing a limb. The teller's pitying look was a fresh humiliation, but with every form I signed, I felt a piece of my sovereignty return. My final stop was the local copy shop. I made triplicates of everything, the financial records, the photos, the lawyer's notes. Knowledge was power, and I was building an arsenal. When I returned to the house, it was late afternoon. I didn't slink back to the utility room. I walked in the front door. Chloe was in the living room, lounging on a sleek new sofa that had cost $3,000, according to my ledger. She looked up, her expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Where have you been all day? I needed you to sign for a package." The entitlement took my breath away. I simply looked at her, the new documents feeling like a shield in my bag. "Out," I said, my voice calm, taking care of some things that were no longer useful to me. I walked past her down the hall and closed the door to the utility room. But this time, I didn't cry. I sat on the wretched folding bed, surrounded by the smell of damp and decay, and I smiled. Because in the silence, I could almost hear the sound of their perfect, parasitic world beginning to crack. The silence from the main house that evening was a palpable thing, thick with unspoken tension. I knew my calm defiance had unnerved Chloe, and my absence had given her time to wonder, to worry. I used the quiet hours in my cell to fortify myself. I reviewed the documents Mr. Aldrich had prepared, a formal lease agreement stipulating a $1,200 monthly rent and a separate, legally binding repayment plan for the $45,000, to be paid at $1,000 per month. The cold, black-and-white reality of it was both terrifying and empowering. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a contractual negotiation for the return of my life. I heard Mark's car pull in late, long after dark. I waited, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I heard their muffled voices through the walls, Chloe's sharp and rising, Mark's a low, weary rumble. I expected a confrontation, a knock on my door, demands for an explanation. But none came. The master bedroom door closed and the house fell silent. His cowardice, his utter failure to even face me, was the final, definitive confirmation. The son I had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who would close his eyes to his mother's humiliation. The next morning, I enacted the next phase of my plan. I waited until I heard Mark leave for work, then I emerged. I didn't skulk. I walked into the kitchen where Chloe was sipping a kale smoothie, her phone in hand. "I need to speak with you and Mark tonight," I said, my voice cutting through the morning quiet. "Here, at 7 p.m. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "We're busy. He has a work call." "Cancel it," I said, and the steel in my tone made her blink. "Or I will have the papers delivered to him at his office by a process server. Your choice." The color drained from her face. "Papers? What papers?" "You'll see at 7, I said, and turned to leave. I had an appointment to keep. I drove to the small, rent-controlled apartment I owned in the old factory district, the one asset I had never transferred to Mark. The tenant, a quiet young teacher, was surprised but agreeable when I explained I would not be renewing her lease due to a family emergency. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was eclipsed by the stark necessity of having an escape hatch, a place that was unequivocally mine. This was my retreat, my sanctuary in waiting. From here, I could wage my war without being a prisoner in my own backyard. At 6:59 p.m., I stood in the living room of my house. I had laid out copies of the documents on the coffee table, my coffee table. Mark and Chloe entered together. He looked haggard, unable to meet my eyes. Chloe looked furious, her arms crossed tightly. "Mom, what's this about?" Mark began, his voice tired. "Chloe said you were making threats." "No threats, Mark, consequences." I gestured to the documents. "Sit." They sat, and I watched their faces as they read. Mark's went from confusion to dawning horror. Chloe's from anger to sheer, incandescent rage. "Rent," she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "You want us to pay you rent. This is our house." "No," I said calmly, locking eyes with her. "It is not. The deed is here." I tapped the copy on the table. "It has always been in my name. You have been living here by my permission. That permission is now being formally revoked unless you agree to these terms." Mark was staring at the financial summary, the list of his and Chloe's expenditures next to the statement of my drained savings account. "Mom, we. $45,000, Mark. You spent my retirement. You let her sell your grandmother's furniture. You put me in a shed." The words were stark, unadorned. I let them hang in the air. "It was for the house, for us," Chloe yelled. "For your grandchild." "Ah, yes, the baby," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "How is the mother-to-be feeling? Any morning sickness? Cravings?" The shift in my tone, the sudden, pointed focus, threw her. I'm fine, tired. The doctor says I need to avoid stress, which is why this is completely unacceptable." "Which doctor?" I asked. "I'd like to call them. As your landlord and ostensibly the grandmother, I'd like to understand what accommodations you need." Panic, pure and undiluted, flashed in her eyes. "That's a violation of privacy. You can't do that." "I can and I will," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Unless you can provide me with a doctor's note confirming the pregnancy. Today." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked from me to Chloe, his confusion deepening. "Chloe, what is she talking about? Dr. Evans is your ob, just give her the number." Chloe was frozen, a rabbit in the headlights. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The lie, so carefully constructed, was collapsing under the weight of a simple, logical request. "She can't," I said, answering for her. I reached into my folder and pulled out the final piece of evidence, Mr. Aldrich, and I had secured a certified copy of Chloe's medical records, obtained through a legal channel after my conversation with her own guilt-ridden mother. Because there is no baby. There never was. I slid the paper across the table. It listed a diagnosis from 3 years prior: severe uterine scarring, rendering natural pregnancy impossible. Mark snatched it up. He read it once, twice, his face crumbling with each word. "No," he whispered. "No, this is a lie. We saw the tests, the pictures." "Bought online," I said softly, the fight going out of me, replaced by a profound, weary sadness for the son who had been so thoroughly duped. "It was all a lie, Mark, to get the house, to get the money, to secure a comfortable life for herself." The sound that escaped Mark's throat was one of pure animal anguish. He crumpled to his knees, the paper falling from his hands. He looked at Chloe, his eyes begging her to deny it. But the mask was off, her face contorted into a snarl. "You stupid, stupid man," she spat at him. "Of course it was a lie. Did you really think I wanted to be saddled with a baby? With you, I needed the house. I needed out of my debt." The confession, so venomous and true, shattered whatever was left of my son in that room. He wept, great, heaving sobs on the floor of the house he had helped steal from his own mother. I looked at Chloe. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The eviction notice will be formalized tomorrow. As for the money, I will see you in court." I turned and walked away, leaving the ruins of their marriage and my son's world behind me. There was no victory in it, only the cold satisfaction of truth. The aftermath was swift. Chloe was gone within the week, leaving a trail of new debt and shattered credit in her wake. Mark, broken and ashamed, moved into a small apartment. He began therapy. The payments on the debt started coming every month without fail. It was his penance and my necessary, painful boundary. A year later, I sit in my yellow house, the deed framed on the wall. The utility room is a potting shed again. Mark comes for dinner every Sunday. We are careful with each other, our relationship a fragile, mended thing. The trust is not fully restored, and it may never be. But he is trying. And I, Eleanor Vance, at 68 years old, have learned that a clean-out, while painful, can make room for a new kind of peace. A peace built not on the shifting sands of family obligation, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of self-respect. I had to tear my life down to the studs to rebuild it, and I built it stronger,